22 years. Think about what 22 years actually means. It means you have watched someone sleep next to you more than 8,000 times. It means you have eaten somewhere between 16,000 and 20,000 meals in the same house as another person. It means you know the sound of their cough and the smell of their shampoo and the specific way they laugh when something actually catches them off guard versus the way they laugh when they are performing laughter for a room. It means you have argued about money and about whose family to visit at the holidays and about the temperature of the thermostat and about every small and large thing that accumulates between two people who have decided to share a life. 22 years means you have earned the right to believe you know someone, not just the version they present, the actual person underneath all the presentation. 22 years means you have been given enough data and enough context and enough repeated exposure to a human being in every possible state, exhausted and sick and afraid and proud and devastated, to have formed what should be a complete and accurate picture of who they are. That is what 22 years is supposed to guarantee you. That is what Elena believed she had. That is what a single phone notification took away from her in the time it takes to read 6 words. Welcome to Venom Thread, where the truth is darker than fiction. And tonight we are dismantling a 22-year picture one piece at a time until there is nothing left of it but the truth. Her name was Elena, and she had what most people who knew her would have described without hesitation as a good marriage. Not perfect. She would have been the first to say that, and she said it often because she believed that people who claimed perfect marriages were either lying or not paying attention. But good. Solid. The kind of marriage that had weight to it, that had survived things, that had been tested by the ordinary and extraordinary difficulties of 2 decades of shared life, and had come through each test still intact and still recognizable as the thing it had started as. Her husband was a man named Richard, and Richard was by all external measures an excellent husband. He was present. He was reliable. He came home when he said he would come home. He remembered birthdays. He was good with their 3 children who were now adults and had grown up in a house where the parents appeared to genuinely like each other. He had friends who had been his friends for decades. He had a reputation in their community as a straightforward and trustworthy person. He coached youth sports for 11 years and showed up every single time. He was the person neighbors called when something needed doing, and he always came. He was, in the specific language that would later feel so grotesque to Elena that she could not say it out loud without a particular expression crossing her face. He was a good man. The community believed this. His friends believed this. His children believed this. Elena had believed this every single day of the 22 years she spent building a life with him, and that belief had not been carelessness or naivety. It had been the entirely reasonable response to 22 years of sustained, deliberate, expert performance. The phone was not hidden. That is the first thing Elena will tell you if you ask her how it started, and it is the detail that matters most for understanding how completely and for how long she had been managed without knowing she was being managed. The phone was not in a drawer or a locked box or a second jacket pocket or any of the places that the cultural script of spousal discovery tells us these things are supposed to be found. The phone was on the kitchen counter, charging, just sitting there the way phones sit in houses that have nothing to hide. Elena had reached for it to check the time because her own phone was in another room, and she was in the middle of cooking, and the stove clock had been wrong for 3 weeks because nobody had reset it after the last power outage. She picked up his phone to check the time. The screen was already lit from a notification that had arrived 30 seconds before she touched it. And the notification sitting on that screen, sitting there in plain sight on the phone, sitting in plain sight on the counter, was from a name she did not recognize, in a thread that had a length visible in the preview. And it contained 6 words that she read once, and then read again, and then a third time, because the first 2 readings could not possibly be what they appeared to be. 6 words. And 22 years. The ratio of those 2 things is something she says she will spend the rest of her life finding the language for. There is no language. There is only the 6 words, and the 22 years, and the 8,000 nights she had slept beside a person who was capable of both. She did not open the thread immediately. She put the phone back exactly where it had been on the counter. She turned back to the stove. She finished cooking the entire meal. She plated it. She served it. She sat across the table from Richard for 45 minutes and had a conversation she cannot now recall a single word of, and watched him eat, and watched him laugh at something their youngest had sent in the family group chat, and watched him be exactly and completely himself, The present and reliable and good man Richard she had known for 22 years, and she felt, beneath the surface of that dinner, the specific sensation of the floor becoming uncertain under her feet, while every object in the room remained perfectly in place. The table was the table. The food was the food. The man across from her looked like and sounded like and moved like the man she had married. And the floor was not solid. After dinner, Richard went to his home office to finish some work. Elena cleared the table and loaded the dishwasher and wiped down the counters, and then she picked up his phone from where it was still charging on the counter, and she opened the thread. What she found inside it was not a single affair. It was not the manageable and in some ways familiar story of a husband who had fallen for someone and made a mistake and compounded it by not confessing. What she found was the entrance to a network of communications across multiple contacts that the oldest visible messages suggested had been operating not for months, but for years. She did not read everything that first night. The volume was more than one sitting could contain. She noted the names and the dates and specific language. She replaced the phone exactly as she had found it. She went to bed. Richard came to bed an hour later. He said goodnight. She said goodnight. She lay in the dark beside him for 4 hours without sleeping, and she felt, not the floor dropping away, but the particular quality of attention that arrives when information makes everything that was previously confusing suddenly and terribly clear. In those 4 hours she did not cry. She did not shake. She did not feel what she had always assumed she would feel in a moment like this, which was a kind of collapse. What she felt was calibration. Everything she had attributed over 22 years to her own anxiety, her own tendency to sense problems that were not there, her own emotional volatility when Richard had told her gently and patiently that the volatility was hers and not a response to anything real. All of it was being recalibrated in real time against the information she had just been given. Every moment of uncertainty she had ever experienced in this marriage was being retroactively explained. Not by her instability, by his management of her perception of reality. She lay in the dark beside him, and she understood that she had spent 22 years being the most important person. In a production she had not known was a production. And she made in those 4 hours a series of decisions that she would execute with a steadiness that she described to me later not as strength, but as the particular clarity of a person who has nothing left to lose by finding out the truth. The first decision was to find out everything before she did anything at all. Not some of it. Not enough to justify a confrontation. Everything. Because she understood something that most people in her position take much longer to understand. That the moment of confrontation, when it arrives before the full picture is assembled, is the moment when a person who has sustained a deception of this scale and this duration will begin to manage what is revealed. And managing what is revealed means permanently limiting what can ever be known. Elena had lived with a man for 22 years who had maintained a parallel life, while sharing a bed and a family and a social world with her. That level of sustained deception does not belong to a person who crumbles when confronted. It belongs to a person who is deeply and expertly practiced at controlling what the people around him believe. She had already given him 22 years of uncontested access to her understanding of her own life. She was not going to give him one more day. She hired a private investigator on day 3. On day 4, she opened a private email account Richard had no knowledge of. On day 5, she retained a divorce attorney in a city 40 miles from the one where they lived so that no one who knew them would see her name on a client list. She did these things without changing her behavior toward Richard by a single observable degree. She continued to cook dinner and sleep beside him and attend the social engagements on their shared calendar and respond to his texts with the same timing and tone as always. She was, from his perspective, exactly the wife she had always been. She was, from her own perspective, a woman. In the final weeks of a 22-year relationship who was spending every available moment building the architecture of its conclusion. She went through the complete history of their shared finances with the attorney and with a forensic accountant the attorney recommended. What they found reframed not just the recent past, but the previous decade. There were accounts she had not known existed. There were expenditures the forensic accountant identified as consistent with the maintenance of a parallel life. The specific pattern of spending that appears when a person is covering costs across 2 existences at the same time. Pressures and tensions she had attributed over the years to normal financial stress were not those things. They were the cost of his deception being distributed invisibly across their shared money. She had been financially participating in a life she did not know was being lived. She had been paying for it with her own earnings, her own sacrifices, her own deliberate choices about what to spend and what to save. She had been a contributor to a project whose existence had never been disclosed to her. The investigators' report took 3 weeks to complete. It was 41 pages long. Elena read it alone in the parking lot of a supermarket in the city where her attorney's office was located because she did not trust any location that Richard had any possible connection to. She sat in her car, and she read 41 pages from beginning to end, and when she was finished, she sat still for a very long time. She was not crying. She described the state she was in as something beyond the normal range of emotional vocabulary, a cold and complete clarity that had temporarily suspended the usual relationship between information and feeling. She knew everything. The feeling would arrive later in waves over weeks and months, and would continue to arrive long after the legal proceedings were finished. In that parking lot, there was only the knowledge, and the cold, steady assessment of what to do with it. The 41 pages contained things that went significantly beyond what the phone had shown her. The report detailed a social network around Richard that included people Elena had known for years, not peripheral acquaintances, friends, people who had been in her home repeatedly, people who had sat at her table at dinner parties and birthday celebrations, and the wake when her mother died 3 years earlier. People who had known about the reality of Richard's life and had chosen silence. Not 1 or 2 people who had stumbled into the knowledge and not known what to do with it. Multiple people across multiple years who had made a deliberate and sustained calculation that their relationship with Richard and with the comfortable architecture of their social world was worth more to them than honesty to Elena. People who had looked at her face across her own table and chosen the lie because the lie preserved something they valued, and the truth would cost them something they were not willing to pay. This is the element of Elena's story that caused the most extensive collateral damage when the truth eventually arrived. Not the affairs themselves, which once the initial revelation was absorbed became in some ways the least surprising component, but the network of complicit people. Because when Elena's attorney sent the notifications that went out 6 weeks after the parking lot, they did not go only to Richard. They went to every person the 41 pages had identified as having had direct knowledge. The letters were not angry. They were informational. They said in precise and legally careful language that the recipient was understood to have had prior knowledge of specific facts relating to the marriage of Elena and Richard, and that Elena was now also in possession of those facts, and was proceeding accordingly. 11 letters. Same morning. By that evening, 3 separate households were in significant internal crisis. By the end of the week, the social structure that had held their community together for over a decade had fractured along lines that none of the people inside it had anticipated because none of them had ever genuinely believed that Elena would find out, or that finding out she would proceed without giving any of them the opportunity to manage their own position before the information arrived. She had given none of them that opportunity deliberately. They had not given her one either. Richard did not fight the divorce proceedings. His attorney made several attempts to negotiate settlement terms that would have significantly reduced his financial exposure, and Elena's team declined, each one with a consistency that made clear the parameters were fixed. He attempted through his attorney to request a direct conversation. Elena declined. She had been in a conversation with Richard for 22 years, and it had been a conversation in which she was the only participant saying what she actually meant. She did not require another one. As the months of proceedings continued, Richard's response shifted from negotiation to a kind of careful social and professional damage management, working through the fallout from the 11 letters, attempting to reconstruct some version of a credible narrative about himself in a community where his credibility had been comprehensively dismantled. Elena watched this from her legal and practical distance and felt, to her own surprise, something closer to exhaustion than anger. The anger came, but it came in private and in pieces, and it was not the defining emotional experience of the process. The defining emotional experience was the gradually increasing weight of recognition. The recognition of how many moments across 22 years she had been right about something and been quietly and expertly redirected toward doubting herself, and how much of her energy and her attention and her sense of herself had been consumed by that redirection. I asked Elena about gaslighting specifically. about whether, looking back from where she now stood, she recognized the mechanism by which Richard had managed her perception of her own life over 2 decades. She was quiet for a long time before she answered. And then she said, "The thing about gaslighting that nobody tells you is that it does not feel like being lied to. Being lied to has a texture you can eventually detect if you are paying attention. Gaslighting feels like being gently and patiently corrected by someone who loves you. It feels like being cared for by a person who is more stable and more clear-eyed than you are." Richard never dismissed me loudly. He never told me I was irrational or unstable or wrong in any way that I could point to and name. What he did was quieter and more effective than that. Whenever I felt uncertain, whenever the floor felt unsteady beneath me, he would respond with patience and reasonableness, and he would reframe my unease as something that was originating inside me rather than responding to something real in my environment. And I would accept that reframing. I would accept it because it came from the person I trusted most in the world, and because the alternative, that the unease was accurate, that the floor was uncertain because something was actually wrong, was too costly and too frightening to sit with. She paused. She said, "The alternative was accurate. Every single time. For 22 years the floor was uncertain because he was making it uncertain and then convincing me the instability was mine. I was not wrong. I was managed. There is a difference, and it took me 22 years and 41 pages to understand it fully." The settlement was finalized 9 months after the initial filing. Elena stayed in the house. This had been important to her, and she had negotiated specifically for it. Not because of sentiment alone, though sentiment was present, but because she had selected that house and made every decision inside it for 16 years, and the fact that those decisions had been made inside a lie did not remove her ownership of them. The house was hers. The life she had lived inside it was hers. The meals and the children's childhoods and the ordinary and extraordinary years of a life that had been real even when the person she was living it beside was not. All of it was hers, and she was not going to be removed from her own history because someone else had been dishonest inside it. She lives in the house alone now. Her children visit with varying frequency, and the complexity of the family landscape is ongoing and is not something she pretends has been resolved. She has new friendships built after the event, with people who know her as herself rather than as one half of a couple that no longer exists. She has a garden she has been expanding every spring. She has a life that is entirely and provably honest. Every room is what it appears to be. Every person who enters it is who they say they are. And she says the difference between that and the life she lived before is not something she can adequately describe to a person who has not experienced the contrast firsthand. The closest she can come is this. It is the difference between breathing air and breathing air you did not know was being rationed. You do not know how little you were given until you are finally given all of it. Thank you for being here on Venom Thread tonight. If this story found you where you needed it, share it with someone who needs it too. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. New Darkness drops next week. We are not done.